Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream on History by podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Samuel Zinner, and today we're going to be talking about Josephus Flavius and the historical Jesus. Does Josephus really mention Jesus? And I've talked about that several times on the show. And of course, we're going to be talking about it many more times in the future. And it's always fun to talk about. And there's so many different opinions on this one little paragraph that Josephus wrote in the Antiquities, or allegedly wrote, if we're going to include the skepticism regarding that. And Dr. Zinner has been on in the past, and he's talked about how the Testimonium has been misinterpreted. And I wanted to go into more detail with him today on this. So welcome back to the show, Samuel.
It's a pleasure to be here always, Jacob.
The pleasure is all mine. And so here's the first slide, obviously. Testimonium Flavianum hasn't been misinterpreted. And now I want to take us to William Whiston's translation of it. This is no problem. This is the typical thing that's cited by most people, is William Whiston's translation. And what stares out at them the most, aside from the reference or apparent references to miracles close to the end of the paragraph, is he was the Christ. And the thing that jumps at them, that's the thing that jumps out at them, and they'll say, there's no way Josephus, who was a Jew, wrote such a thing. So how do you respond to that, Samuel? And is there a problem with Whiston's translation while we're at it?
Oh, well, the last point, right, is as I've explained before, and I didn't come up with this explanation. It's from a Novum Testamentum essay published in 2010 by Ulrich Victor. It's in German, so those in the audience who know German can look it up. What he points out is actually very elementary, to anyone who's studied Koine Greek or even classical Greek. All right. So first of all, you have to keep in mind that this Greek edition that we have of Josephus wrote it for a pagan, let's say a Greek audience. He did not write it for his Jewish compatriots, right? So you have to keep in mind his wording is geared toward a pagan audience that he's trying to please, of course, right? Now, so he starts off by talking about a man named Jesus, or Jesus, right? All right, so this is a Jewish name, right? And so the reason he then later on says that he was Christos, he was it's usually translated, he was the Christ, right? But what Ulrich Victor points out is that in Greek, as in several other world languages, a personal name can often take the definite article, right? So this should not be translated, he was the Christ. It should be translated, he was Christ. Now, he's not writing to Jews, so he's not saying this is the Messiah. He is writing to a pagan audience. So he starts off by using the Jewish name of this person he's talking about. And so what he then qualifies this, he explains it more. He says, oh, by the way, this Jesus, right, this non-Greek name, right, this is the person that you're hearing about these days called Christos. So he's using it as a personal name here, not as a messianic title, right? So it's as simple as that, right? And of course, that argument takes on a lot more weight and convincing power in light of everything else that Ulrich Victor and others, right, explain about what's going on here, including in the first, in the opening here, which I see in the Greek here is missing something very important, right? So we have this starting off, genetai de kata tuton, ton chronon Jesus tis. So there should be a tis, a particle, a tis after Jesus. And in Josephus, this usually carries a negative, pejorative valence, usually referring to robbers, seditious people, right? And so the question is, why has this tis word, this tis, dropped out of the manuscripts? It's the best explanation is that Christian scribes didn't like it because of this pejorative connotation, and they removed it. Right? To argue the other way around really doesn't make much sense. So it would be translated, right, that about this time there lived a certain tis, a certain Jesus. And again, this certain or tis has this usually has this negative flavor, this negative valence, right? Usually with reference to seditious rebels. Right.
And when it comes to Josephus referring to the title Christ, when he says ho Christos otos hen, what do you make? How would you translate the Greek word here, otos, in this context? Because I know it can, in certain circumstances, it can mean he, or it can mean in this manner or in this way. The different, based on the different usages of otos or hotos. Is it could it possibly mean ho Christ could a ho Christos otos hen? Could it mean that in this manner he was the Christ?
I guess it's possible, but I don't think it's probable. It seems a stretch. It just seems pretty straightforward. Ha Christos, utas, right? Ein, right? So this was Christ, right? So this Jesus I'm talking about, this is to you Greeks who don't know the name Jesus. It's not a Greek name, right? You probably have heard him under this name, Christos or Ha Christos, right? So I don't. It's possible, but it seems a stretch to me. It doesn't seem natural, right? What you're proposing there. As far as he was, right? I know James Charlesworth, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and others have made the point that is very odd. Why would a Christian say that he was the Christ? But this is just a simple matter of Greek grammar. Well, Josephus is reporting the past, right? And so, of course, he's this decades before the publication, right, of this history. And so this is all he's saying, right? This Jesus I'm talking about, he was Christos, this man you're hearing, this name Christ, right? So the Greeks are understanding it as a name instead of what it is in Judaism, right? Which it would be a messianic title, but he's not writing to Jews. So certainly the Greek audience would not know, any kind of messianic or theological import of Christos, right? So they would take it as a proper name, right? And he's reporting something that happened decades in the past. So so Christos utas ein, right? He was, right? Not he is, right? Because he's not talking about the present. He's talking about the past. He's not talking about the present yet. He is present. He does a little later, of course, as you know.
So, when, say, the 3rd century CE Origen of Alexandria encountered the works of Josephus, and he seems to be not so pleased that Josephus does not believe that Jesus is the Christ, would it be at least a reason that the way that Josephus says he was the Christ, or even saying he is, could that have been one of the things that could have possibly have irritated Origen?
I think there's a lot in this paragraph that would have irritated him. And so some have made the argument that this Christos, right, it couldn't have been in Origen's copy of the Testimonium, right? Because he says that Josephus did not believe that Jesus was the Christ, right? But I think Origen would have understood that here in this Testimonium, Christos is intended to be a personal name, and it's not Josephus right, declaring that he believes that Jesus was the Christ. So only that he was called Christ, not the Christ, but Christ, right? By this personal name, because just as so many Christians throughout the ages, Greek-speaking Christians, right, have mistakenly believed that Christ is a personal name, right, without recognizing that it's actually a title, right? At least according to the Jewish understanding, and the early Christian understanding of it as well. But for a pagan audience, Christos, this is a name, and it was going around, right? And this is the reason Josephus is writing this Testimonium, because this movement is making sort of a stir at the time.
And so would it be fair to say that this is the language here would obviously be consistent with the language in the James passage in Antiquities book 20, when he says that I don't have the slide here, but I'm just going to read it from over here. And Jesu to legomeno Christo, Jesus who was called Christ.
Again, he's using it as a personal name, right? But that would be the most natural interpretation of that, based on this, which is fuller, right? The Testimonium on Jesus is fuller, right? So we need to look at the shorter expression embedded in the James account through the prism of this longer account, where we have more information about how Josephus is using language. And here he's using how Christos is a personal name. And so I would think that he's doing it elsewhere also. He says, well, yeah, the brother of this person who's called Christ, right? For the Greek-speaking audience, the personal name for them.
So would you say that, based on what you're saying right now, that based on the over time, when the copyists, the scribes were copying Josephus, including this passage, when they omitted tis, a certain, did they omit anything else, or was that just about it, and everything else is pretty much the same?
No, look, it's very difficult to know what an original reading, an original text would have been, because scribes change so many things. But what we'd have to do is go through it, word by word, phrase by phrase. This is what scholars do, looking at the different manuscript evidence, right, to determine these sorts of questions. And sometimes there's higher degrees of confidence we can have. Sometimes it's a toss-up. But as far as tis goes, this is a very strong argument that it must have been deleted by Christians, right? Because why in the world would anyone else have omitted it? It was admitted by Christians who found it offensive, right? And the later Christian scribes could have read this and seen that, yeah, we can, if we make a few changes here, one could read it a little more positively than otherwise would have been the case. That is, earlier readers, right, conversant with Josephus Greek, right? And what I mean also is, if you extract this from its context, right, you could read into it to a degree things that were more positive than actually there. You can't get I really don't think you can get rid of all of the negative connotations that some of these terms imply. But contextually, if you keep it in the context, right, where it is found, where it's preceded and followed by all these stories of wicked rebels, that helps us also to interpret what's going on in here. Why there's this tis, why there's a verb that Whiston probably translates as, I forget how he translates it, but it would be he led away, right, many among his people and among the Greeks, right? In other words, deceived, right? So if you read it in context and you know what some of these verbs actually contextually in the other stories surrounding this, usually have negative valences. So this is another way that you can read it. But later scribes who just focused on this and then quote it, outside of the context, right, in some Christian account of history or something, and they're going to do extracts from Josephus, right? You can make it appear a little more positive than it actually is, but if you keep it in the context, that's I don't know. I think it's impossible, but anyway, to each their own.
What do you say to the claim that this is pretty much, for the most part, coming from mythicists? They love to say that the Testimonium is filled with idioms that don't appear anywhere else in the time of Josephus or in Josephus's text. What do you make of that?
You can go throughout Josephus and find passages where you can say the same thing, because he had entire archives, right? And so he would incorporate material from writings he had written. There was no need to completely rewrite everything in his own idioms. Right, so you can find this throughout Josephus, and that's when you can, of course, in those dozens, hundreds of passages, that's where you can determine he's relying on a written source, and he's not redacting it or rewording it heavily. Right, that's so elementary. That kind of argumentation is a non-starter.
And so do you think that the original Testimonium, I know it's difficult to know what it originally looked like, but we have different variants of the Testimonium that are, as you know, way later than Eusebius' time. And a lot of people will interpret your arguments as saying that the Testimonium Flavianum is either fine the way it is or largely fine the way it is. So based on the data we currently have, are you saying that the Testimonium as it is was practically the same, most likely the same exact one that Josephus had, just slightly different perhaps? Or
yeah, I think so. Yeah, yes.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, and again, refer the readers to Ulrich Victor's essay, and he goes through it phrase by phrase, showing how one can understand it contextually. And then it doesn't end up selling like hogwash, some Christian fabrication. For instance, the thing about Jesus. So Josephus is not saying, oh well, this Jesus was the Messiah. We're saying this Jesus, he's the guy that you Greeks are all hearing about, called Christ, right? And so you can do this with all the other sayings. For instance, the self is honor. He was a wise man. So how could Josephus say that if he thought he was a rebel? Well, Ulrich Victor points out that this group of Sophis Andres, right, wise man, he says, and I'm translating all this from German into English, right? It's not homogeneous. It's not a homogeneous group. When you read about the wise man, the Sophos Honor, right, or the Sophoi Andres, I should say, in the plural. Like you have Abaris and Pythagoras, right? They were both wonder workers, miracle workers, like this Jesus he's talking about, Josephus is talking about. But you have to understand that Abaris, Pythagoras, these were often the butt of jokes and comedy in ancient literature, right? And so let me quote Ulrich Victor on this. And again, this is my translation, right? when Josephus calls Jesus sophos honor, he places him despite all exclusivity, not in completely undisputed company. In other words, Josephus concedes nothing when he mentions Jesus in the following way: for he appeared to them after 3 days alive again, and this and 1,000 of the miraculous things the divine prophets had already said of him. Josephus speaks, even in this sentence, to a Greek audience in the terminology familiar to them. All right, so in the Septuagint, there's not a single mention of divine prophets. These are instead patterned after the theoi andres, right? The theoi anthropoi, which are, the divine humans, the divine men, which are found in Greek literature from Plato to Diochrysostom. Furthermore, Josephus does not say on the third day he appeared alive again, but rather on the third day he appeared to them alive again. And that means, but no one has to believe it. So he's reporting beliefs and claims. He's not affirming the veracity of them. So in this way, Josephus therefore brings Jesus into association with two other sophoi andres, whose reputation in the contemporary public opinion was by no means beyond suspicion. So it's a matter of knowing some more information about ancient Greek mentions, of wise men. So this is not a totally positive term, especially when it's then followed by this thing about wonder workers and divine prophets. And how does he say it? Saying 1,000 other miraculous things. Yeah, right. So this is reportage, right? It's not affirmation of the beliefs that he's quoting. Of course, not everyone is going to be convinced by that argumentation. But the fact is that there are, accounts of these, what is called the same term, wise men, of people that were, the object of comedy, right, in ancient Greek literature. So this is a very wise man can be this could be positive. This can be neutral. It could be negative, even with a comedic slur to it.
Do you think that the Gospels encountered the Testimonium Flavianum when they were using Josephus?
Luke, sure, Luke. The reason I would say that is Gary J. Goldberg, his 1995 essay, I think it's 1995, somewhere in the 90s. He calls it the coincidences, but the coincidences of the Emmaus narrative of Luke and the Testimonium of Josephus in the Journal for the Study of the Pseudepigrapha. Now, he demonstrates in there that there is a literary relationship between the Testimonium Flavianum and Luke's Emmaus narrative. This story about Jesus after his purported resurrection on the road to Emmaus. Now, Goldberg posits that, Josephus and Luke are depending on a common source, right, that shared a lot of the same language. Right? That's his argument. I think that's not the most parsimonious way of looking at it, right? Because we know elsewhere Luke did use Josephus, right? And many scholars have recognized this, especially in the early chapters of Acts, the telltale signs of Luke's use of the antiquities, especially, right? It's clear, right? So if we know, and a good number of scholars have documented this, if we know that Luke used Josephus, right, in the early chapters of Acts, and then if we find some almost some kind of literary relation between almost the very end of Luke, which is like the first volume of this 2-volume set, Luke Acts, it's usually called the Gospel of Luke or the Book of Acts, then I think the most parsimonious conclusion, right, it would be that Luke in the Amos story is also relying on Josephus. Where in Josephus? Well, it's the Testimonium Flavianum, right? So what I would say that Luke is doing is drawing on Josephus because he wants to use this, respected Greco-Roman historian, right? But Luke, of course, is transforming, or he leaves out everything that's negative about Jesus in the Testimonium, right? And just for obvious reasons, right? Luke was a member of the Jesus movement, thought Jesus was the Messiah and all of this. So, of course, he's going to leave out all the negative stuff, right, from the Testimonium Flavianum. Right? But anyways, that's the most parsimonious conclusion. If we know that Luke has borrowed from Josephus, just like, I don't know what it is, 2, 3, 4, 5 chapters after the Amos story, and then we find a documented Goldberg, documented this literary relation, right, between the Amos story and the Testimonium Flavianum. Well, I think that's the most economical, the most parsimonious interpretation of that evidence is that the Testimonium Flavianum already existed in the copy of Josephus that Luke had access to, which I would say would have been about, give or take, 115, the year 115 of the Common Era.
Yeah, I love when you bring that argument up, because that makes perfect sense to me, because I just find it personally absurd to think that, okay, so Luke knows Josephus, and then a later copyist inserts stuff from Luke and then puts it into Josephus. And I'm like, wait, hold on a minute. Okay, let's slow down. Let me think about that argument for a minute. You're telling me that B uses A, and then C uses B to interpolate something back into A.
Yeah,
Why not just say B got it from A?
Yeah, I think right, and I think what really people are trying to make us believe is that basically someone would have reworked the Amos story and put it into Josephus. Possible, but a lot of things are possible. But as historians and textual critics, we want to figure out what's more probable than not, and try to establish some ladder, some scale of degrees of probability. And Occam's, it's called Occam's razor. Occam actually didn't compose that saying, but anyway, the Occam's razor is really saying that we should not unnecessarily create entities. Right? That's basically what he's saying. He's not saying that the simplest explanation suffices. That's ludicrous, because life and textual relationships and many things can be very complicated. So it's the important point there is that we should try to end up with the theory, right, that is most economical or parsimonious in the sense it has the least number of entities that we have to create in order to get the theory, right, to explain the evidence at hand. Right? So, sometimes, the facts have an explanation that is very complicated, right? So, Occam's razor doesn't have anything to do with simplicity, although sometimes things do end up being pretty simple. And I would say too, right, many scholars have documented, and Steve Mason, for instance, right, has done a good job at documenting how Luke relies on Josephus in the early chapters of Acts. But there, and then I think Goldberg, even though he would not agree with what my argument, even though I think it's the most parsimonious one about the Amos story relying on the Testimonium, right? There are other places where Luke reflects his knowledge of Josephus. I mean, I think actually that he's used quite a bit. I mean, a handful of passages from Josephus's autobiography, from his life, his vita story, right? It's the evidence is not as strong, but it's intriguing. And in view of the fact that we know that Luke did use Josephus elsewhere, when you start coming up with maybe 4 or 5 intriguing parallels, then I think it's worth not discarding the possibility a priori. Right? You know, I can go through some of those points if you want me to, where I think that Luke is reworking, right, Josephus' autobiography in the gospel. But be that as it may, my point is saying.
Could you go through those points?
Yeah, well, what I'm talking about is especially in Luke 2, right, where he talks about Jesus as a 12-year-old in the temple, talking with the priests, right, about the law and all of this. So this has always reminded me of Josephus' account of himself at age 14, right? This is I made. You can imagine, right? So this is Josephus writing about himself at 14. And I made mighty proficiency in the improvements of my learning and appeared to have both a great memory and understanding. Moreover, when I was a child and about 14 years of age, I was commended by all for the love I had to learning, on which account the high priests and the principal men of the city, Jerusalem, came then frequently to me together in order to know my opinion about the accurate understanding of points of the law, the halakha, right? You know, of course, for us, it's a bit odd that someone would write this about themselves, right? It sounds precocious to us. But in any case, very much immediately we're going to think of the story about Jesus in the temple, right? Talking about you know, the law or whatever, right? In the temple, right? And then the difference being between 14 years and 12. I don't know, maybe if this is so, then maybe Luke felt Jesus had to outdo Josephus. I don't know. But anyway, there's also if you very famously, right, Josephus, this account of him at age 14 in the temple, right, teaching halakha to the high priests, is followed by his description, right, of him living in the desert with the desert ascetic Banus, right. He lived with him from about age 16 to 19. And Josephus says that when I was about 16, which again might be a stretch, but anyway, Luke 3:23, right, we have that same imprecision, right? When Jesus was about 30 years old, right? He begins his ministry, and that, of course, involves John the Baptizer, this desert hermit, like Bonus, right? And then, right, so I'm not going to push that, but those are intriguing. Now, next, this reminds me of more of the book of Acts than Luke, the Gospel of Luke. But Josephus then says when he was 26, he sailed to Rome, right? Felix was the procurator. And he went there to secure the release of priests, right, that had gotten on the bad side of Nero. So what happens? The ship sinks, and Josephus is rescued, of course. Then he meets a Jewish playwright who introduces him to Nero's wife, and Nero's wife secures the release of the imprisoned priests. Right? So again, you can think of the book of Acts where Paul gets arrested. He sails to Rome in a ship that sinks. He's rescued. Of course, right, ships did actually frequently sink in the ancient world, and I guess some people were on occasion rescued. But in any case, the last parallel I would point out then goes back to the gospel stories, and that is, right, this, at least for those in the field, the famous story that Josephus gives towards the end of his vita, or his life, where he chances upon 3 of his acquaintances on crosses, they're being crucified. And he asks Titus for their lives. Titus grants them. Physicians treat them. 2 die, 1 lives. Right. So who knows? But anyway, all of those examples would say we can't be sure that Luke is reworking Josephus. But given that we know that elsewhere he does, I think we at least should be on the lookout for parallels like this that may or may not turn out to be evidence, right, for Luke's further reworking, right, of Josephus.
What do you make of Jerome's version of the Testimonium Flavianum? Because some will say it looks slightly different from the one that's in Eusebius.
But what's new?
Do you think he was trying to change some of the details himself that he didn't like in his own time?
It's possible, right? That's possible, or he may be just repeating some version that was already present in a manuscript of Josephus, or already present in some extract, right, in some non-Josephus Christian tract or whatever. Right. So, but things were, I mean, everything was changed in the ancient world. All of these documents, I mean, so, and for different reasons, right? Through accident, through mistake, through theological programs or biases, right? And so with Josephus, of course, he's himself somewhat of an historian. He likes to write, treatises about the history of saints and all of this. So, right, Christian historians wanted to pattern themselves after Greco-Roman historians because of the prestige and all of this. So, right, so that's what I say, what's new, right? So there's some difference in Josephus' version. We can say this about almost any ancient piece of writing. Oh, in this other author, there are these differences. Well, yeah, what's new? So what you do, you look at the differences and you try to determine based on the tools of the trade, historical methodology and interpretation, exegesis of what may have led to those differences.
And what do you make of the testimoniums that were created much later, like the ones that we get from Michael the Syrian, Agapius, and elsewhere? Do you think these different people are trying to create different versions of the Testimonium, maybe to fit their theological purpose or whatever that may be?
In some cases, certainly. Right? And the more something gets copied, especially non-contextually, out of context, right? The more it becomes plastic, right? And can be molded in whatever direction, right? An author wants. As I say, with a lot of the Christians who would quote it for different reasons, right? So either maybe there are non-Christians, I mean pagans, let's say pagans, Greeks, and they're lodging the claim there was no Jesus. This is just a myth, right? And so Christians are going to try to respond with, well, here's some historical evidence from Josephus, right? And so some may quote Josephus without trying to erase any of the negativity, because even if it's negative, right, this would be perceived as historical evidence, right? Others would probably quote it out of context, which then you can make it sound a little more positive, right? So sure, and the later it gets reworked in history and chronology through the centuries, right? The more it can change in different ways. It can become more elaborate, it can become longer, it can become truncated and shortened, right? So this idea that we should look at comparative textuality, codicology, and things like this, right? As if they obey the laws of biological evolution. This is absurd, right? Some texts get lengthened, right, in the history of the redaction. Some get truncated and shortened, right? So it's a matter of each and every case. You just have to apply the tools of the trade to try to figure out what's going on. Is it some interpolation here? Is it something being taken out? And then, of course, a lot of scholars these days, sometimes I like to think I may be one of them. I mean, sort of like to shy away from the old talk about, well, what was the original reading, right? It's better to look at all of the evidence. Sometimes we can determine the original reading, I think, and maybe not for an entire document, but for certain aspects of it, like the tis, right, in the opening of the Testimonium Flavianum. But other times, it's better just to take all of the evidence that exists and accept each one as it is and explain each one, right, as it is, right? Instead of trying to think that we can actually reconstruct ancient texts down to the last word. Well, sometimes maybe so, especially maybe if it's some kind of the genre. Some genres are better help text to be better preserved than others, like poetry, right? So let's say you're going to have a certain poem with a certain letter count that's very important, right? So, then if you know that there's deliberate letter counts involved in each line or something like this, then you could probably try to restore an original, right, for a lot of the poem or maybe the whole thing even. But for something like Josephus, these long texts, whose early witnesses we don't have much of. Most of our witnesses are very late. Right? It's I don't like the old, especially 19th century German school, right? That when they thought they could reconstruct anything, they just with a pair of scissors, right, and just cut away what your ideology doesn't agree with, right, and just paste in what you want to be there. Right. And, boy, if you knew German, you could read a lot of this 19th century biblical criticism literature and just fall off your chair laughing. It was so biased. Right. And so I think reception history, right, is very valuable. Let's study these texts for how they were received. Right. And let's look at each of the witnesses, each of the variants, and appreciate each one for what it is, and try to understand each one on its own terms, right? And then we could try to more or less try to figure out, what a certain text may have originally said to a certain degree, right? But let's not be overconfident either.
And so my closing question, where do you think Josephus may have heard about Jesus? Do you think he got his information about Jesus from maybe hearing about the death of James, for instance? Or did he hear it from elsewhere?
Well, who knows? I would imagine that, right, he has access, right? His access to written materials, right? State archives, government archive, empire, imperial archives, really. Right? And of course, he was a Jew. Right, and so no doubt he would have heard, right, of Christians, right, and so he would have been curious, and he probably would have found information in imperial archives as well. And of course, if you read the Testimonium, really, what you see, the reason he's putting it in there is that he's giving the history of Jewish, mostly in that portion of Jewish rebels, right? And so decades before, right? And so he puts the story of Jesus in among all these other stories of seditious Jews. most of those other seditious Jews, it's just a matter of history. But he puts a testimonium in there, not only because there's a matter of ancient history, not ancient for us, but relatively recent history for him and a number of decades, but it's because this messianic pretender, after his death, actually still there's a movement that's still devoted to him, in contrast to all the other, like Theudas and all the others. They get beheaded or chopped up or killed or crucified, whatever, and that's the end of their movement, right? But that's not the case with Jesus, and so there's extra motivation to write about this, and that extra motivation is because he expresses that Jesus, in his view, led astray many Jews and many of the Greeks. Of course, now, right, you see that Josephus is not being, accurate historically there, right? So the historical Jesus may have led away many Jews, but the whole outreach to the Gentiles, this is something that happened under Paul and in later decades leading up to the time of Josephus, right? So Josephus is just collapsing history here and ascribing everything to the founder of the movement, right? And he's using imperial archives, but this movement is around, and so he's hearing it. And so if you read the epistles of Paul, the ones that are authentic, at least according to majority opinion, right, he has contacts, right, in Rome, in the household of Caesar, whatever all of that means, right? And so we know that there were many Romans, right, interested in Judaism. So since the Jesus movement sort of started out there, right, so it makes sense that whatever. Now, of course, the Testimonium and then the existence of Christians or followers of Jesus, in the time of Josephus, is not proof that there was a historical Jesus. So I'm not saying the Testimonium proves that. Right? It just, all it proves is that in the time of Josephus, there was a Christian movement, basically, of whatever proportion, right? But he's dealing with archives, and most of the time he's interested in the past in this writing. But in this one instance, right, it is pertinent to his present, right? Because these troublemakers, right, are still among us, right? And if you notice, again, I would say that the Testimonium Flavianum, it's preceded by the story of a political uprising, and I'm talking about the story of Pilate's Jerusalem aqueduct. I'm not going to give you the details, but then comes the story of Jesus, then the story of Paulina, and Fulvia, and they're all examples involving religious deception, right? Then you got the story of Jesus, and it's followed by, about the same time, also another sad calamity put the Jews into disorder, right? So, and then the story of Jesus, the Testimonium Flavianum, it's followed by the story of a Jewish teacher, right, who has 3 followers, and they defraud this proselyte Fulvia. So this is a Fulvia I mentioned. And so he goes, there was this man, he was a Jew. He was driven away from his own country, right, by this accusation that he had transgressed their laws. And he was professed to teach men the Torah of Moses, the wisdom of the laws of Moses. But anyway, he defrauds this, rips off this Fulvia as a woman of great dignity, right? Who is a Jewish proselyte, convincing her to send purple, cloth and all of this, and gold to the temple in Jerusalem, right? So they got all of this and used it for their, right? They ripped it off from her. They stole it from her. And Tiberius learned of this through Saturnius, right? That's the husband of Fulvia. So anyway, so why is that story in there? Well, there's some scholars who actually believe that's sort of like a Paul-like story, right? So Paul was sort of thought of as being a character like this, right, defying proselytes. But in any case, there's this interlude story about Paulina that I mentioned, and that involves deception and a story of crucifixion, right? And it's a story of the temple of Isis. So what's this doing in this history of section of Jewish rebels? Well, the temple of Isis, this is something Greek, right? So it's linking back to the Greeks that are mentioned in the Testimonium Flavianum, right? So if you look at the narrative flow here, that's sort of links the two passages together. And in the story of Paulina, Josephus means to emphasize that Judaism is to be separated from the Oriental cults, like ISIS, Greco-Roman Oriental, right? And so this is also the main story, the main reason for the Jesus story of the Testimonium Flavianum is to emphasize that the new Christian cult is to be separated in the minds of his readers, right, from Judaism proper, right, from the main body of Judaism. So all of these stories of Jesus, Paulina, Fulvia, and the Samaritan uprising, right, instigated by a false prophet, are about religious deception, right? So anyway, that's probably a mouthful, but there you go.
And where can people go find your work?
Academia.edu. Just do a Google search and Samuel Zinner. You can also find a lot of my interviews on YouTube. I have a channel. I haven't done anything in a couple months. My health hasn't been all that good, but I have a lot of interview videos there. My channel is called Just Nowhere. So just type in Just Nowhere or Samuel Zinner on YouTube, and you'll find out about 70, 80 interviews on there. A lot about religion, ancient texts, but modern stuff too, psychology, philosophy, what you will.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Samuel Zinner.
My pleasure, always.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.